soldiers gathered around a fire near the headquarters of the British forces, just outside Lieutenant Colonel Edward Fitzpatrick's tent. The men, exhausted, looked cold and war-torn. Edward removed the kettle that steamed by the edge of his fire, placing it on a flipped ammo crate. Gesturing to his men to make a cup of tea, he took a moment to look at each of the men who stood in front of him, then boldly spoke. Many strange stories have been circulating the camp. Rumors of a terrifying beast. The beast shows no allegiance to either side of the war. The stories, rumors, and hearsay is that it attacks German forces, British forces, and French allied forces alike. It attacks without prejudice, but with ferocity and volatility. Edward explained that he had gathered the men here because he had heard that each of them had their own accounts with this beast. He wanted to hear their stories to uncover what was truly happening. The unexplained killings of his men, bodies torn apart in ways that didn't match any report from the front lines, had left him deeply unsettled. His mission tonight was to gather as much information as he could. The men exchanged uneasy glances, their faces heavily with discouragement. They drank their tea in silence until Captain Geoffrey Kensington broke it, lighting a cigarette with a practiced hand. "Come on, lads," Geoffrey said, his voice calm but firm. "It's time we speak of this madness. We're in the presence of the Colonel. I know he'll want to hear the solemn God's honest truth." The men hesitated at first, reluctant to be seen as superstitious or insane. But Geoffrey's words gave them the confidence to begin sharing their experiences, one by one, growing more at ease as each story was told. The first account came from Private Samuel Campbell and Benjamin Brown. They told their story as though it had only just happened, the terror still fresh in their minds. They explained how they had been positioned at the very front, at the sentry detail or listening post. They were stationed with 6 other men, manning a small outpost beyond the trench line, to gather intelligence and monitor enemy activity. That night, a light rain began to fall, pattering softly at first, before steadily increasing. The men, already exhausted, groaned in frustration. The last thing they wanted was rain. Then came the sound. At first, it was faint, almost rhythmic, like hoofbeats, running back and forth beyond the post. None of the soldiers could see anything in the darkness, and then, all at once, all hell broke loose. A large beast crashed into the outpost trenches without warning. It lunged at one of the soldiers, biting down on his throat. The others froze in shock, too stunned to react. In the darkness, it was impossible to tell what exactly was happening. But the sounds were unmistakable. Muffled gurgles, gnawing, and the sickening crunch of bones snapping between the beast's teeth. Rain pattered relentlessly as chaos erupted. One soldier fired blindly into the darkness, and for a brief moment, the flash of his rifle illuminated the scene. A dark, charcoal gray beast stood before them, towering at 8 or 9 feet tall. Its muscular frame seemed grotesquely human. The soldiers panicked, turning their gun towards the creature, but before they could aim properly, the beast pounced, moving faster than any man could follow. It tore through the soldiers, ripping them apart. To make matters worse, the gunfire gave away their position to the Germans. Enemy bullets sprayed in and above the outpost, further adding to the chaos. Benjamin and Samuel, realizing the only chance of survival was to flee, scrambled out of the trench, running in opposite directions. The German gunfire continued to rain down, and a flare shot into the sky, casting an eerie glow over the battlefield. Samuel sprinted towards the primary trench, screaming the code word, "Neptune! Neptune!" repeatedly as he ran, hoping the men in the trenches wouldn't fire on him by mistake. He stumbled over the trench wall in his panic, throwing himself to safety. Benjamin, meanwhile, tripped over something in the muddy rain. As he scrambled to his feet, he glanced back and saw the silhouette of the beast darting away into no man's land. Its speed unnatural, twice that of any human. Summoning the last of his strength, Benjamin pulled himself up and ran as gunfire cracked behind him. He screamed, "Neptune! Neptune! Neptune!" at the top of his lungs as he leapt over the trench wall and collapsed inside, where Samuel was already yelling incoherently. "Beast! Germans! I don't know, something!" Samuel stammered. "Aim! For the love of God, shoot it!" The soldiers in the trench opened fire on the German line, unable to see what had just transpired at the outpost. Samuel and Benjamin locked eyes, their faces pale with terror, neither able to comprehend what they had just witnessed. After the 2 men had finished recounting their story, silence fell over the group. The other soldiers were clearly disturbed, puzzled by what they had just heard. Edward reached into his pocket and pulled out a silver foxhole lighter, along with a tin of finely rolled cigarettes. Lighting one, he took a deep drag, his gaze fixed on the flickering flames of the fire. His expression remained unreadable as he mulled over the story, his narrow eyes glancing briefly at Geoffrey, who offered him a knowing look. Edward said nothing, his silence heavy with thought. Edward remained silent, his cigarette glowing faintly in the dim light of the fire. The other men waited uneasily. Finally, Geoffrey turned to Second Lieutenant Oliver Drumford and said, Second Lieutenant Drumford, you're up. Oliver looked at Samuel and Benjamin, taking in the weight of their story. He scratched his head, pursed his lips, and reluctantly gave in to the captain's command. Oliver was a bit of a jokester, and often approached situations with a lighthearted attitude, but the tale he had just heard unnerved him. Still, he tried to mask his unease. Well, he began, I was up with the boys in the north at Avelieu, probably the furthest north on the front you could get. He paused, gauging the men's reaction, then continued. We all know how the battle started up there. Complete botch. But we were doing our damnedest to hold, with barrages of artillery pounding day in and day out. Oliver sighed. Edward shot him a rigid, respectful look, silencing him briefly. So yeah, Oliver resumed. We all know how it started. By the time we fought through October, we'd locked in south of Thiepval. But we were stuck. No progress towards Waylandcourt. It was a stalemate. One night, me and the other boys were keeping an eye out, shooting off flares every now and then to scout for troops' movements. The Germans' fortifications between Thiepval and Waylandcourt, well, it was a bloody fortress. We couldn't break through. We were ordered to hold our position day in and day out. Just so happened that Lieutenant Colonel Edward here, he nodded towards Fitzpatrick, got orders to throw us straight into the enemy. I tell you, we were terrified. That fort hadn't been breached once, not even close. Any advance was cut down before it could even make progress. Then we got word that in the morning we were going to attack. There would be artillery cover, a thick smoke barrage to blind the Germans. Still huddled in our trenches, we all thought that the Reaper might call us home that day. Oliver's expression grew more somber as he continued. The night before the attack, we were all sitting in silence. The moon was full, the clouds rolling past. Then we heard it, this sound from the enemy's fort, like a dying rabbit. You ever heard one? High-pitched squeal, like a child screaming? Awful. What followed was chaos, gunfire, screaming. It sounded like the gates of hell had opened. We couldn't believe what we were hearing. At first, we thought it was some kind of an attack, our allies breaking through, but the noise ended as suddenly as it started, with one last pistol shot and silence. Oliver paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the group. He sent word back to the line, but all I got in return was, we advance in the morning as planned. He glanced at Edward, who shifted slightly, acknowledging the commands given that day. Oliver chuckled grimly. As morning comes, the sun rises, and artillery barrages start. Smoke everywhere. I told the lads to keep their heads down, move cover to cover, and make for the walls of that fort. The horn sounded, and we charged. Gunfire rained down from the German trenches on our right, but not a single shot came from the fort. I thought maybe I'd already been hit. Maybe I was dreaming, but no. We all made it to the fort. Every last man in my squad, not a single casualty. I shouted for the boys to light it up, and we lobbed grenades through the windows. Then, we pushed in, firing into the smoke, expecting heavy resistance, but when the smoke started to clear, Oliver trailed off, his eyes fixed on the fire. It wasn't what we thought. The bodies, German soldiers, were torn apart. Not by grenades we lobbed in. These weren't shrapnel wounds. This was something else. Something savage. Guts spilled everywhere. Blood on the ceilings? I've never seen anything like it. Oliver shook his head, his voice quieter now. And the smell. Jesus. It smelled like death had taken a bath in that place. It was horrifying. He fell silent, staring into the fire. After a long moment, he turned to Edward. We took the fort. I sent my report up to you, sir, saying something wasn't right. Something went too well. Whatever got to the fort first probably saved me and my men's lives. Edward finally spoke, his voice steady and deliberate. You and your men made a valiant push. We would have taken that fort either way, but yes, I read the report, and after hearing Jeffrey's account, I've come to believe that there is something happening here. Something I intend to get to the bottom of. Jeffrey nodded solemnly. Gents, he began, dark rumors have been spreading among my ranks. Men have gone missing in the night. Dedicated soldiers, the kind who would never desert. And it's not just that. Personal belongings left untouched, no signs of a struggle. There are reports of strange sightings of animals moving in the shadows, eyes reflecting in the darkness. The howling, we've all heard it, but this isn't normal. It's something else. He paused, his face drawn with tension. One night, during a light drizzle, I was making my rounds. The men were huddled in their trenches, the moonlight reflecting off the muddy puddles that we've all come to despise. That's when I heard it, blood-curdling howl. At that moment, I started to believe the devil himself was walking among us. Jeffrey spat into the fire, his expression hard. I screamed for the men to take positions, but as I scanned the horizon, I didn't see Germans. What I saw were eyes, glowing yellow eyes, higher than a man's head. They flashed and disappeared, only to reappear again, darting left and right, studying us. Whatever it was reading us, looking for a weakness. He leaned forward, his voice dropping. Growing up, my father and his friends hunted big game in Africa. I remember one of them telling a story about a man-eater lion. He said you could see its eyes reflecting in the firelight as it circled around the village, looking for its next victim. That's exactly what this beast reminded me of. Jeffrey took a deep breath. I wasn't about to let it take one of my men. I grabbed a flare gun, aimed at the eyes, and fired. The flare hit roughly 35 feet away. The beast let out a roar of agony and fled into the night. He looked around at the group, his hands outstretched over the fire. That's when I knew, he said. Knew what? Samuel asked, his voice breaking the silence. That it wasn't a mirage, not a ghost or a spectral, Jeffrey replied. Whatever this thing is, it can feel pain. It can be killed. Edward cleared his throat, and the men straightened instinctively at the weight of his command. He lit another cigarette, the flicker of his silver lighter briefly illuminating his face. Studying the lighter for a moment, he finally looked up at the group. I've discussed this with Jeffrey, he paused, letting his words hang in the cold air. I've received orders from command. Later this week, we're to advance and attempt to capture the German footing in Peronne. Edward bowed his head slightly before continuing. This beast has become more than a nuisance. Men are missing. Reports are piling up on my desk, each one stranger than the last. Fear is gripping the men. When we take Peronne, there must be no room for distractions. No more of this demon. He took a long drag from his cigarette, exhaling slowly. My brother, he was a priest, North Riding, near Welbury. This was back in 1867. He's nearly 25 years my senior. But as a young man, he used to return to Stalbridge in Dorset, where my family is from. Whenever he visited, he loved to tell us a particular story, me and my cousins, who were about my age. At the time, I thought he shared it as a cautionary tale, a way to keep us in line. But now, Edward's voice trailed off for a moment. He continued, his tone grave. My brother would recount. Listen here, lads. When I first joined the service of God, I was sent to study with Father Bandinal. He forbade me from entering the asylum beyond the abbey. He said it housed great evils, that only one truly devout should enter, to let the sisters care for those poor souls. Father Badinal promised that in time I would learn the strength of faith to confront such things. For years, my brother obeyed, but the stories of the asylum fascinated him. Then one night, Father Badinal took him there. Edward shifted his stance, his voice dropping. It was a cold night, with only the rustling of leaves carried by the wind. A full moon lit the grounds. Father Badinal told my brother, "This is the night when the devil calls forth his most wicked children to come play among the mortals. You must hold fast to your faith tonight." He handed my brother a silver cross and led him down a spiral stone staircase to the basement of the asylum. Edward's gaze turned hard. As they descended, the sounds of rustling chains and guttural growls echoed through the darkness. Father Badinal warned him, "What you see tonight will test your spirit. Do not cross the dark stones that mark the boundary." My brother carried a lantern forward, step by agonizing step. He said the darkness seemed alive, and every sound, clinking chains, growls, felt like it was closing in on him. Edward took a deep breath before continuing. At the end of the corridor, just 3 paces from the boundary stones, my brother saw it, a hulking figure, its yellow eyes reflecting from the flickering lantern light. He stepped closer. The thing lunged, its arms extending through the bars of its cell. He described the arm as being over 4 feet long, covered in matted black fur, with claws like talons, and a snout filled with sharp, gnashing teeth. Saliva dripped from its gums as it snarled and howled. My brother raised the silver cross, and the beast recoiled in pain. It retreated, its eyes blazing with fury. Edward's voice grew quieter. Father Badinal told him, "Now you have seen the devil's hound. May you walk in the light of God, and beware of what lurks on nights of the full moon." He let the story settle over the group, the firelight reflecting in their wide eyes. My brother believed that the creature was a lycanthrope, a man cursed by the devil to become a beast. He always warned us that the darkness could corrupt any soul that strayed too far from the light. Edward's gaze swept over the men. Now, here we are, in the closest thing to hell on earth, and I believe the devil's hound walks among us. After everything I heard from you, I'm convinced this beast must be a lycanthrope, and I intend to kill it. Jeffrey stepped forward, his voice steady. I'm with Lieutenant Colonel. I know I wounded the beast with that flare. I heard its cry, felt its anguish when the sulfur seared its skin. The men exchanged uneasy glances, their eyes fixed on the fire as silence descended over the group. Edward broke the silence, his tone firm. Listen, I brought you all here for more than just storytelling. Jeffrey and I have been discussing a plan. With his knowledge of hunting, Jeffrey, interrupting with a nervous chuckle. Well, hunting is a pastime back home, but in regards to this beast, I only recount my father and his friends' tales. I've never hunted big game myself, Edward continued. We've come up with a plan, but we can't do this alone. You've all seen or been a part of something involving this beast. I need you to trust me. You're the only men who won't think I'm mad for asking this. I could be court-martialed just holding this meeting. So, I'll ask you now. Will you help me eradicate this creature? Think of the lives we'll save. Your fellow countrymen. We must extinguish this flame of the devil. The men stared into the fire, the weights of Edward's words sinking in. After a moment, Oliver spoke up, his tone half joking. My father always said I wasn't good for much. Maybe I'll go home a war hero, or a beast slayer. Hell, I don't even know if I'll make it past Perron. Might as well try and do one good thing with my life. He pulled a flask out of his jacket, taking a swig. This plan better work, Captain. Relying on stories from your father's hunts is a gamble. Geoffrey responded, his voice resolute. It'll work. Has to. Edward turned to Benjamin and Samuel. I know this is a lot to ask. The two young soldiers exchanged a nervous glance before Benjamin found his voice. Let's bring this beast to its knees. Samuel nodded in agreement, his expression determined. Edward clasped his hands behind his back, stepping close to the fire. Tilting his head skyward, he watched the clouds roll past the moon. Tomorrow night, the moon will be full. We'll review the plan now. Tomorrow night, we'll execute it. We'll bring down this beast of the Somme. Sunset was falling over the battlefield as Edward and Geoffrey made their way through a back trail leading northwest. Edward had driven them as far as possible, choosing a location once captured by Allied forces, near a forest on the edge of the River Somme. The land bore the scars of war, its terrain a testament to artillery strikes and bitter fighting. As they marched, Edward glanced at Geoffrey. So did you get the commander briefed and ready in case the plan goes sideways? Yes, sir, Geoffrey replied promptly. Told him everything you instructed. He knows to assume command if necessary and believes I've been called back to receive instructions on our push for Perron. He's prepared to take over if things go south. Edward nodding approvingly. Good. They moved with purpose. The other men had been sent ahead earlier to prepare the site, under the guise of punishment and latrine duty. As Edward and Geoffrey crested a hill, Oliver's voice rang out below. Look who finally decided to show up, Oliver called, his tone light. Edward scanned the area. In the distance, he saw a road crossing a damaged bridge over the River Somme, and further still, the faint rooftops of a northern French village. The position was exactly as he had planned, a location which the reports of the beast seemed to center around. Reaching the bottom of the hill, they found Oliver, Samuel, and Benjamin waiting. Edward wasted no time. Let's see where we're at. Oliver gestured towards a sturdy oak with a fork in the trunk, about 12 feet up. That's Geoffrey's spot. He'll be up there with the marksman rifle. From that height, he's got a clear view of the valley and the clearing. The clearing stretched before them, a patch of land leading to marshy cattails by the riverbank. A large cow was staked down near a makeshift cage about 100 meters away. The cage, cobbled together from repurposed materials, looked sturdy enough, though rough in its assembly. Around the clearing, pre-prepared fires sat ready to be lit so they could light up the valley. Oliver continued, pointing towards the left. Samuel and Benjamin will be in the trench we dug. It's got an overhang to help conceal their position. As for me, set up a blind between those two boulders on the right. It's small, but gives me a decent line of sight of the cage. Oliver grinned and added, Pretty thick-headed of you to be the bait, sir, but I have to admire your courage. Edward allowed himself a brief chuckle. Take that as a compliment. Walking to the cage, Edward tested the bars with a firm shake. It seemed sturdy. This will have to do, he said, half to himself. He turned back to the men. Everything looks as it should. Well done. Passing Samuel and Benjamin, he offered them a small nod of approval before heading towards the central fire. There he removed his silver lighter and a tin of cigarettes. Lighting one, he studied the flame momentarily before speaking. My brother always said silver was blessed by the angels, forged in the creation of the world as a weapon against the darkness. It's why the church casts its crosses in silver when facing the devil and his legions. Tonight we'll put that belief to the test. Edward handed the light to Geoffrey. Melt this down. Tip every bullet we have with a bit of silver. With only a few hours left before nightfall, Geoffrey accepted the lighter and got to work, using an overturned soldier's helmet from a past battle as a makeshift crucible. They melted the silver. Geoffrey dipped each bullet, ensuring it received a gleaming tip. By the time the final round was ready, the last rays of the sunlight had faded, and the night closed in around them. Edward paced inside the cage, his boots crunching softly against the earth. Nearby, the cow shifted nervously, its breathing uneven. A thin cut on its flank oozed blood, a lure for the beast. Edward's eyes scanned the surroundings, noting every shadow and flicker of light from the fires. The valley was unnervingly quiet. Frogs had stopped croaking by the river's edge, and the usual chirping of crickets was absent. The only sound was the faint rustling of the trees in the breeze. Edward gripped his Webley, the weight of the revolver reassuring in his hand. Suddenly, a howl pierced the night, chilling and close. Edward's heart pounded as he shouted, "This is it, gentlemen! Let's rid this land of this foul hell beast." From his vantage point, Geoffrey was barely visible in the Y-shaped oak. but Edward caught a faint glimmer of his rifle barrel catching firelight. The others were hidden, but Edward knew they were ready. Then, silence. The clouds above shifted, parting to reveal the full moon. Its light bathed the clearing, and in that light, Edward saw them. 2 yellow eyes glowing from the darkness. They were low to the ground, but as the figure approached, it rose. It towered over the clearing, easily 9 feet tall, its hulking silhouette. Ears twitched, scanning the night, and its nostrils flared as it caught the scent of the blood. With a burst of feral speed, the beast lunged at the cow, landing on its back with a sickening crunch. The cow screamed, its legs kicking in a futile attempt to escape. The beast tore into its neck, blood spraying in the moonlight as it thrashed its claws. Edward stumbled back, his webley raised, the speed and ferocity filling him with uncertainty. He fired, the shot echoing through the night, but the bullet missed, hitting the cow instead. 2 more shots rang out as the beast darted behind the cow's carcass, using it as cover. Breathing heavily, Edward steadied himself and fired again, this time hitting the beast's thigh. A roar of pain erupted from its throat, and it charged the cage, its claws rendering the iron bars like paper. Edward scrambled backwards against the back of the cage, his webley fumbling from his hand, grasping for the flare gun in his holster. The beast's claws tore at the opening it was making, its glowing eyes locked on Edward. Just as it reached through the gap, Edward fired the flare into the sky. The night lit up like the day, revealing the beast for all its grotesque glory, its matted fur, blood-stained fangs, and those haunting eyes. From the hills, rifle shots rang out, bullets ricocheted off the cage and zipped through the air. The beast howled, retreating briefly before turning and bolting towards the boulders that Oliver was concealed in. Edward screamed, "Fire! Fire!" The men unleashed a volley of bullets, but the beast moved too quickly. It reached Oliver's dugout blind, ripping through the stakes and logs with terrifying ease. Oliver barely had time to scream before the beast's jaws clamped down on his head, twisting and tearing him free from the ground. Edward leaped out the hole that was created in the cage, grabbing a torch from a nearby fire, waving it wildly. He shouted, "Come and get me!" The beast turned, limping slightly from the wound in its leg. Blood dripped from its jaws as it snarled, stalking towards Edward. Time seemed to slow as it leaped, its claws outstretched. A crack rang out, a single rifle shot from Jeffrey's position. The bullet struck true, piercing the beast's chest. It landed hard, knocking Edward to the ground before stumbling backward, clutching at the wound. Whimpering in agony, it stumbled and struggled to pull itself to its feet. But when it did, with a final roll, it fell into darkness. Edward lay sprawled on the ground, staring up at the stars in the faint glow of the moon. His breath came in and out with ragged gasps, his chest burning from exertion and pain. The metallic taste of blood lingered in his mouth, though he wasn't sure if it was his own. Sir, are you all right?" Jeffrey's voice cut through the haze. He appeared above Edward, his face streaked with dirt, his eyes wide with adrenaline. He shook Edward gently, his hands trembling. Edward nodded weakly, wincing as he sat up. "I'm fine, just winded." He touched his chest, finding several shallow scratches where the beast's claws had grazed him. Blood oozed from the wounds, staining his shirt. "You hit it?" Edward asked, his voice hoarse. "You must have hit it. I saw the shot." Jeffrey nodded, through the chest, but it ran off. He gestured toward the darkness, his voice filled with frustration. "It's not dead, sir. Not yet." Samuel and Benjamin emerged from their position, running towards them with rifles clutched in white-knuckled grips. Their eyes darted nervously to the shadows, scanning for any sign of movement. "Is it dead?" Samuel asked breathlessly. "Did we get it?" Benjamin added, his voice cracking. Jeffrey shook his head grimly. "No, it's wounded, but it fled." The realization hit him like a blow. Edward forced him to his feet, leaning on Jeffrey for support. "Oliver," he muttered. Jeffrey turned towards the boulders, his face pale. He stumbled forward, the others following closely behind. What remained of Oliver laid crumpled beneath the ruins of his blind, a sight so grisly that Benjamin turned away and retched. Jeffrey dropped to his knees beside the body, his hands shaking as tears rolled down his cheeks. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I tried, but it was so fast." Edward placed a steady hand on Jeffrey's shoulder, his voice firm, despite the tremor in it. "We'll bury him here. At first light, we follow the tracks. This isn't over." The men worked in grim silence, digging a shallow grave. The task was grueling, not just physically, but emotionally. They placed what was left of Oliver into the ground, covering him with dirt and stones. The weight of the moment hung heavily over them. When it was done, they returned to one of the still burning fires. Mud, sweat, and blood clung to them like second skins. Edward retrieved the last of his cigarettes, lighting one with a stick from the fire. He passed it to Samuel, who shared it with Benjamin. Another was lit for Jeffrey. They smoked in silence, the embers of their cigarettes glowing faintly in the pre-dawn darkness. As the sun began to rise, Jeffrey crouched near the area where the beast had been shot. His sharp eyes scanned the ground, and after a moment, he called out, I've got it. A trail. It's heading north, towards the village. Edward pushed into the forest with him, examining the faint streaks of blood on the ground. The others gathered around, their exhaustion momentarily forgotten. It's fresh, Jeffrey said. We're close. Weapons ready, they followed the trail. The terrain grew marshy, cattails swaying in the breeze as the sound of the river Somme grew louder. The trail of blood led them to a dense thicket of bushes. Jeffrey halted, pointing ahead. There, he whispered. Edward moved forward cautiously. Among the bushes lay a figure, a naked man, pale and gaunt, his hand resting over his heart. His eyes were partially rolled back, lifeless. Jeffrey knelt beside the body, examining it closely. Burn mark marred the man's shoulder. A bullet wound was visible in his thigh. He gently lifted his hand, a bullet wound in his chest. He looked up at Edward. This is him. Samuel peered over Jeffrey's shoulder. He looks French, he murmured. Edward nodded, his expression somber. A local, perhaps. Someone who knew these woods well. Jeffrey hesitated before speaking. Sir, I know this might sound extreme, but can't risk it. We should take the body back and burn it. Samuel and Benjamin exchanged uneasy glances, but said nothing. Edward took a deep breath, weighing the decision. Finally, he nodded. Help me carry him. They lifted the man's lifeless body and carried it back to the clearing. Using wood gathered from the surrounding area, they constructed a makeshift pyre. Edward fashioned a crude torch, lighting it from the dying embers of the fires. As the flames consumed the body, Edward stood silently, his thoughts a chaotic mix of relief and sorrow. His men watched the fire, their faces etched with exhaustion and grim determination. Let's move, Edward said finally, his voice resolute. He turned and began walking toward the sunrise, his steps heavy but purposefully. The others followed, casting one last glance at the burning pyre before trudging onward. The journey back to their lines was quiet, each man lost in his thoughts. Morning light revealed the full extent of their weariness. Stressed muscles, mud-caked uniforms, hollow eyes, and the lingering stench of blood. When they reached the British trenches, Edward slunk into his tent, solemnly filling out his report, omitting any mention of the beast. To the official record, Oliver Drumford's death was attributed to enemy action. For Edward, the memory of the night would never fade. The beast of the Somme was gone, but its shadow lingered, a reminder of the horrors that lurked, not just in war, but in the shadows and darkness. As he lit up a cigarette with his newly obtained lighter, Edward stared out over the new front, over the Peronne battlefield. The clouds parted, gave way to the full moon. The war raged on, indifferent to their sacrifice. With time, the stories and rumors turned to whispers, fading among the ranks of the men, and the beast of the Somme became legend.